Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on community volunteers, risk and liabilities for community-led disaster response. My name is Monica Taylor and I lead the Disaster Resilience and Capacity Building project here at Community Legal Centres Queensland. I firstly want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding today's webinar in Meanjin. They are the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. And I wish to pay respect to their elders past and present and to future leaders and acknowledge that these are stolen lands and sovereignty was never ceded. To everyone viewing this webinar across Queensland and Australia, I also pay respect to the traditional owners throughout the country and extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people who have joined us this afternoon. Community Legal Centres Queensland recognises that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the climate crisis is yet another ongoing legacy of colonialism, and it's a problem not of their making. Today, I am really pleased to welcome Leanne Collingburn and Jacob Curry from Hopgood Gannon Lawyers and Jackie Kavanagh from Caxton Legal Centre. Leanne and Jacob will present their recent analysis about gaps in legal protection for Good Samaritan community volunteers who respond to disasters. And Jackie will be discussing the broader implications of this work for the community legal sector. Of course, this webinar is extremely timely because right now we have about 80 bushfires burning across our state, and our disaster laws really need to accommodate the reality of what takes place on the ground when disasters occur. And we know that alongside these extreme weather events, there's a groundswell of community-minded goodwill and rescues, but that behaviour does not come without risk. So we're really fortunate to hear from our speakers today to present their research. I'll just run through some very quick housekeeping before we kick off. This webinar is being recorded and we'll have the recording and the PowerPoint slides available for you after the presentation. I'll be circulating them later this afternoon. We really encourage questions, so you can type your question into the question box on the control panel and I'll read your questions out. I'll hold questions until the end of the presentation, but if they come to mind throughout, just please pop them in there as you think of them. I'll now hand over to Leanne and the team, and I'll be back at the end of the session. Thanks.
Thank you, Monica. Hi, everyone. My name's Leanne Collingburn. I'm a partner and head of pro bono at Hopgood Gannon Lawyers. I'm also on the management committee of Caxton Legal. So Hopgood Gannon Lawyers is a commercial and private client legal practice based in Brisbane and Perth, for those of you who don't know us. We have a dedicated pro bono legal practice as well, which is focused on 3 areas, and you can see them represented in the impact icons on the slide there. So the first is that we work with First Nations communities to achieve the outcomes that they want to achieve. We work to mitigate the impact of environmental disasters, and we work to reduce domestic and family violence. I'll now hand over to my colleague Jacob Curry to introduce himself.
Hi everybody, my name's Jacob. I'm the law graduate in the pro bono team, working with Leanne. And yeah, very excited to be presenting our research on community first responders with you all today.
And Jackie, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Jackie Kavanagh. I'm the disaster recovery lawyer at Caxton Legal Centre, and I've been involved in a lot of the frontline delivery of Caxton's flood response.
We'd also like to acknowledge country. We're speaking to you today from Meanjin, Brisbane as well, so the Yagara and the Turrbal peoples, and we'll pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people joining the session today. On a personal note, I just also want to add that for me, for as long as I can remember, I've been privileged to listen and hear First Nations voices in my life. And as a non-Indigenous person in Queensland and in a position of privilege in the legal profession, I'll continue to use my platform and to ensure that those First Nations voices that I've benefited from, that they continue to be heard, particularly in the legal profession, so that ultimately, hopefully, our laws and policies become fairer. So, as Monica said, the purpose of this presentation today is twofold. Jacob and I will talk to you about some recent research that we've done in relation to the lack of statutory protection given to community volunteers, and we'll define that term for you shortly, when they respond to environmental disasters in Queensland, and discuss the opportunities for reform. And Jackie will share Caxton's experience in providing disaster legal assistance and discuss steps to preparedness. And as Monica acknowledged as well at the outset, we'd also like to acknowledge those that are at this very moment fighting fires in Queensland and responding to environmental and climate disasters. So we wanted to define the term community volunteers as we used it throughout our research. There isn't a clear, I guess, definition that we kind of turned to, so we sort of made up our own in a way. When we talk about community volunteers, we're talking about civilian volunteers or Good Samaritans who are not otherwise authorised persons or authorised volunteers as we've defined them. And those volunteers may or may not be previously known to the person that they are assisting. Authorised persons, on the other hand, are persons authorised under law to undertake an emergency rescue, first aid, or otherwise provide services in the immediate aftermath of an environmental disaster. And just by way of example, as I said, this is our own term, authorised persons, and we've used it to include people like ambulance officers, the SES, Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, and so on. Authorised volunteers, we've used that term to describe persons authorised under law to assist with an emergency response and or first aid. So, for example, where the legislation permits an authorised person to delegate or deem another person to have the necessary expertise to assist in a particular situation where they might not otherwise be authorised to assist. So before we get to our research project and our analysis, we wanted to provide a bit of background as to why we started looking into this. We have there on the slide some links to previous sessions that we've held, and just from an admin perspective, you will get these slides after the session. The image with the play button doesn't work, it's just a screenshot, but if you click on the hyperlinked guest speaker links, you'll be directed to the relevant stories that we talk about. But basically where this project came from, or this research came from, was last year Hopgood Gannam collaborated with Caxton Legal on a what we called a Justice in Focus Water Stories series, where we invited a group of guest speakers whose names you can see on the slide to talk about their water stories on how flooding and environmental disasters had impacted them. And what we wanted to do was get a diverse group of people with different lived experience. For example, Naomi Moran from the Koori Mail, many of you will know the Koori Mail's response to the flood crisis in the Northern Rivers region in New South Wales. Joe Hedger was also part of that response as well, and from that community, albeit not living in that community at the moment, but he went back to that community, and he shares his story through that recording of that experience. And we also interviewed Julie Brooke, who's a town planner, from a planning perspective, what can be done and what is being done in relation to flooding and flood mitigation. Bill Mitchell, many of you will know as the Principal Solicitor for Townsville Community Law, who has done an extraordinary amount of work in this space. So Jackie, who's with us today, interviewed Bill, and you can catch that interview on the link there. And we also interviewed Andrew Gissing, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Natural Hazard Research, to provide his particular insights and water stories in relation to flooding and preparing and responding to environmental crisis. So if you haven't already seen those stories or linked in with those recordings, we really do encourage you to do so, because they're quite interesting and really helpful discussions. But for me, the three key takeaways that I took from that diverse group of speakers were: the first one, which probably comes as no surprise to any of you, that environmental disasters are increasing in scale and intensity, and all of the speakers seem to agree on that. The second is that governments increasingly are lacking the capacity to appropriately respond to these crises, and lack the resources needed to respond because of that scale and intensity. And the third, again, which will probably come as no surprise to this audience, is that communities are the key to delivering better and more holistic responses to environmental disasters. So what we then thought about as a result of those water stories and those key takeaways is, well, if governments are struggling to appropriately respond to these disasters because of their frequency and intensity, and I will say, you know, that, I mean, a live example of that is the experience in Queensland at the moment, where with 1st of November and the Queensland Fire Service are already fatigued and are looking at and are receiving support from Victoria and New Zealand as well. And it's November, so, you know, we've got a long season ahead of us. So if we agree that, you know, we're struggling to appropriately respond, and if we all agree that communities are the key to better environmental disaster respond, and that's the way we're looking and what we want to support, then we wanted to have a look at what legal risks communities face and what legal protections are available when they do step up and step into responding to environmental disasters. So what we did first was we mapped out with a team of lawyers probably about 12 months ago now, what were the kind of key actions and the key responses that communities had done in response to recent environmental disasters. What actions did they take? What was the key legislation in Queensland? We focused in Queensland, being one of the main jurisdictions that we operate in. What are the key legislative provisions and policies that that are applicable to those actions in an emergency scenario? And then what risks are involved, as in what protections are available and immunities and liabilities when communities are kind of stepping into these this type of response. And we mapped out a whole range of different, what we'll call actions, from emergency response, serving food, just like the Koori Mail did in the Northern Rivers response to people in need. We looked at psychological and physical first aid, and operating and businesses operating outside of what they would normally do day to day. Really that kind of community and neighbourhood response where communities are really stepping in and forming like a hub to support those impacted by environmental disasters. And what for Queensland really stood out for us was what we would call a legal loophole or a gap in the law as relates to emergency rescue in Queensland for what we call community volunteers, but civilian or Good Samaritan volunteers. So I mentioned we kind of mapped out the legislative provisions as they related to certain actions, and what we wanted to do was look at, well, if a person was authorised to respond in a particular way and undertake the particular actions in response to an emergency or a climate crisis or emergency rescue, what risks are they exposed to and what protections do they have? And we've got a list of the various statutes that we looked at, which are the current legislative protections under reform at the moment, but for today's purposes, the current protections. And what we found was that authorised persons in many instances and authorised volunteers in many instances have broad powers when responding to environmental disasters, where in the exercise of those powers, their actions or omissions cause damage. Generally speaking, and it does differ, and there's different wording within each of the acts, but generally speaking, they're protected from personal liability if their actions or omissions are in good faith and without reckless disregard, or good faith and without gross negligence and or not for a fee or reward, or done honestly and without negligence. And that wording just differs depending upon which act you are looking at. In some instances, the Crown will also have an immunity from liability, provided that standard of, good faith and without reckless disregard, for example, is met. But nowhere in the legislation could we see that these protections would extend to who we call community volunteers, so those people who step up to assist local communities and friends in circumstances where authorised persons and authorised volunteers aren't available to assist. And I'll just give a brief example of one of these provisions. So the Disaster Management Act of Queensland, it sets out declared disaster powers and rescue powers in addition to other powers under other acts in an emergency. And it contains provisions which authorise a person to exercise rescue powers in an emergency situation if they have the necessary expertise or experience, and we call that, using our definition, an authorised person. And that person may, among other things, and in certain circumstances, require someone else to give them reasonable help to exercise the powers as well. And using our definition, we'd call that an authorised volunteer. Compensation is payable to a person who suffers loss or damage because of the exercise of that power in certain circumstances. And authorised persons and authorised volunteers, using our own definitions, will not attract civil liability for acts done or not done in good faith without reckless disregard in the occurrence of personal injury or loss or damage to property. And that's under the Disaster Management Act. So again, no particular provision that relates to a more spontaneous community volunteer who steps in. So to compare that with a similar New South Wales provision, the State Emergency and Rescue Management Act 1989 of New South Wales Parts 2, 3 and 4 set out the powers and responsibilities that persons have during states of emergencies, and they include similar things like the power to enter premises, power to evacuate, take steps concerning persons, and the power to take other safety measures. Part 3, Division 5 provides for protection from any action, liability, claim or demand or accredited rescue by an accredited rescue unit, authorised volunteers and casual volunteers for anything done or omitted to be done in good faith in connection with a rescue operation or otherwise in response to an emergency. And you can see we've put on the slide there that a casual volunteer is defined to mean a person who assists on his or her own initiative in a rescue operation or otherwise in response to an emergency in circumstances in which the assistance was reasonably given. And we've also put there that the Crown is also immune from liability in certain circumstances as well. So the New South Wales provision provides some protection in certain circumstances for what we would call a community volunteer, but that is missing in Queensland. When we look at general civil liability in Queensland as well, you can see that under the Law Reform Act, medical practitioners, nurses and other persons prescribed under regulation prevented from civil liability in respect of, or immune from civil liability in respect of acts done or omitted to be done in the course of rendering medical care, aid or assistance in a circumstance of emergency. So you've got a person on the street, if an off-duty medical practitioner or nurse or other person prescribed under a regulation comes to their assistance, they are protected from civil liability. Under sections 26 and 27 of the Civil Liability Act, it says that civil liability doesn't attach to a person or a prescribed entity in relation to an act done or omitted in the course of rendering first aid or other aid or assistance to a person in distress if the first aid or other assistance is provided while performing duties to enhance public safety for an entity prescribed under a regulation that provides that service. And we'll fix this on the slides, but the reference to prescribed entity examples there is as under the civil liability regulation. So anyone that's performing a duty to enhance public safety for the Brisbane City Council, Care Flight or Queensland Ambulance Services, etc., would be protected from liability under those provisions of the Civil Liability Act. Also too, under the Queensland Civil Liability Act, Section 39 provides that a volunteer does not incur any personal civil liability in relation to an act or omission done or made by the volunteer in good faith when doing community work that is organised by a community organisation or as an office holder of a community organisation. So if you're a volunteer of a community organisation, then you will also be protected from civil liability. But again, what's missing is if you are what we would call a community volunteer, a spontaneous volunteer, or a good Samaritan, the Queensland Civil Liability Act doesn't provide you with any protection. So compare that to the scenario in New South Wales under the Civil Liability Act. Part 9 addresses civil liabilities of volunteers. Similar to the Queensland provision, but Part 8 provides that a Good Samaritan does not incur personal civil liability in respect of any act or omission done or made by the Good Samaritan in an emergency when assisting a person who is apparently injured or at risk of being injured. And a Good Samaritan is defined as a person who, in good faith and without expectation of payment or reward, comes to the assistance of a person who is apparently injured or at risk of being injured. So that we've just gone through the statute and position under legislation, but we also looked at Queensland's current disaster policies as well, and how they approach or deal with what we would call community volunteers. So the list of policy that we looked at is there on the slide. And generally speaking, again, the policy framework is underpinned by 4 principles: public safety, leadership, participation and performance. The policies generally prioritise the safety of people and property. They acknowledge the need to empower and support local communities. They acknowledge the need for strong partnerships with all stakeholders. They acknowledge that responses need to be scalable and adaptable, but they don't include community volunteers as we define them, and in some instances, like under the Queensland Prevention, Preparedness, Response and Recovery Disaster Management Guideline, they actually expressly exclude what we would call community volunteers. And they, if you have a chance to read further into that guideline, it does further mention community volunteers or spontaneous volunteers, but almost from a deficit front. So as in spontaneous volunteers, as they've defined them, are not skilled, not trained. They are not affiliated with emergency or community organisations, but despite being motivated to help, organisations need to really think about whether they can use them and consider offers from spontaneous volunteers, as they've defined them, in the context of assessing the human and social, cultural, economic and environmental impact that their assistance might have on local community recovery, resilience building, the admin and logistical requirements of trying to coordinate them, the costs associated with managing spontaneous volunteers and coordination of their offers. And it's imperative that volunteering organisations put affected people's needs first and ensure that their activities do not harm or hinder. And whilst we agree with that last sentiment, there's a really, I guess, reluctance to, in the policy frameworks, to really provide for and embrace, I guess, the what we would call a community volunteer. And again, that and we would argue that's probably not a great position. And on that point, I will hand over to Jacob, who is going to talk in a little bit more detail about why we think it matters that that community volunteers are embraced in responding to environmental disasters, but also that they are afforded appropriate legal protection from risk and liability.
All right. Thanks, Leanne. So in our report, we identified 8 key reasons why we believe community first responders should be protected from liability, and we have those up on the screen now for you. And I'll spend and I'll just go over now in a bit more detail on each of these points. So the first reason is that environmental disasters are increasing in frequency and intensity. So research shows that Australia has a variable climate which exposes Australian communities to a variety of frequent natural disasters. Queensland specifically is the most disaster impacted state in Australia, having endured more than 97 environmental disaster events since 2011. Unfortunately, we are already seeing this play out this bushfire season in Queensland. As Monica pointed out at the start of this presentation, there are currently around 80 fires burning across the state, and we have to assume that the worst is yet to come. In direct response to the fires, Anthony Albanese has acknowledged that we are seeing more extreme weather events and they are more intense, and the government needs to respond to these events in the short term. So furthermore, the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangement has found that global warming over the next 2 decades is inevitable, and as a result, natural disasters are expected to continue to increase in frequency and intensity across Australia. So we can expect more concurrent and consecutive hazard events, which increase the pressures on vulnerable communities, with each subsequent hazard event compounding the damage caused by the previous event. For Queensland specifically, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has predicted that heavy rainfall and river floods are projected to increase in central Queensland. For the northern Queensland area, cyclones are set to decrease in frequency but increase in severity. And across all of Australia, the intensity, frequency and duration of fire weather events are projected to increase. The second reason is that there is insufficient government capacity to respond to environmental disasters. Now, we should say this is definitely not a criticism of the good work of the government and official emergency response bodies like the Queensland Fire Service and the SES. But throughout our water stories, which Leanne has already mentioned, we reviewed a number of government reports, and there was a common acknowledgement that official emergency response operations are lacking in their capacity to respond to the increasing number of disaster events. And this is especially the case when those disaster events are consecutive or concurrent. Again, we are already seeing this play out this bushfire season, with Anastasia Palaszczuk announcing that emergency crews from New Zealand and Victoria would be arriving in Queensland sometime this week to provide assistance and relief to our local firefighters. So there is increasing complexity of disaster risks. The increasing complexity of disaster risks has the potential to overwhelm the capabilities of fire and emergency services. And the New South Wales Flood Inquiry heard that citizens played a crucial role in flood rescue and recovery, particularly in the Northern Rivers region. It heard countless stories of everyday people supporting friends and assisting neighbours, and at times putting their own lives at risk to protect the property and save the lives of strangers. The acts were often a direct response to the absence of the expected assistance from the government authorities and emergency services. On the slide, you'll be able to see a first-hand account from a community member, Naomi Worrell, on her experience of being rescued by a fellow community member. I won't read the quote out in full, but it highlights the fact that citizens step in where official government bodies do not have capacity. On reading the New South Wales Flood Inquiry, it is clear that Naomi's experience is not unique, and furthermore, various government reports reviewing bushfire seasons in Queensland confirm that her experience is also not unique to flooding events. The next reason is that there is a decline in formal volunteerism. The New South Wales Flood Inquiry recognised the importance of the community response to flood rescue and recovery, finding that greater expectation and demands are being placed on volunteers as disaster seasons become longer and more intense. Despite this, the inquiry also heard that formal volunteerism is declining, and instead more informal, spontaneous networks are developing prior and throughout disaster events. The National Strategy for Volunteering 2023 has reported a decline in formal volunteerism, with the rate of formal volunteering decreasing from 1 in 3 Australians in 2010 to only 1 in 4 in 2022. Similarly, the state of volunteering in Queensland reported 30% of Queensland volunteers donate their time exclusively in informal contexts, with a further 55% donating their time in a combination of formal and informal capacity. Now, as the slide notes, these statistics from the Queensland report could be skewed by the COVID-19 pandemic, but we still believe it is worthy of mention and that it is something we should keep an eye out for when the next report comes along. Potential reasons for this decline in formal volunteerism were considered in a 2021 independent review of the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services by KPMG. The report identified that key challenges to maintaining official volunteer base included Australia's ageing population, the fact that we are time poor, and digital distractions. The next reason why community volunteers should be afforded liability is protection. Sorry, my bad. Protection is that community volunteerism is inevitable and it saves lives. Whether community volunteers are motivated by necessity or because they are simply the first on the scene, we know that this form of volunteerism is inevitable and is likely to occur in response to emergencies and disasters, particularly where citizens believe that the needs of those affected are not being met by formal response. This was the case during the 2022 floods in New South Wales, where residents and media reported 000 calls going unanswered and civilians chartering their own helicopters to meet the unmet need for aerial rescues and food drops. Furthermore, the flood inquiry acknowledged that without community support for organisations such as the Koori Mail and the Jali Local Aboriginal Land Council, the flood response and recovery would have been much more difficult. Of particular importance, the flood inquiry also acknowledged that without community-led rescuers, it is likely that more people would have died. And this sentiment is reflected in the first-hand accounts of those who were rescued. And so we have a quote on the screen stating that in Lismore, groups including Resilient Lismore and the Koori Mail became a lifeline in a time of crisis. And without these rescues, more people would have died. The next point is that responding to environmental disasters obviously involves risk. Emergency events are notoriously unpredictable, and what looks safe can quickly escalate into a dangerous situation. In flood water, for instance, a seemingly calm surface can mask a fast-moving body of water, and individuals cannot predict what will happen next. Water can contain large debris, sharp objects, or potentially poison or sewage. Also, given that we're living in Queensland, depending on the area, large snakes or crocodiles could also be hidden under the water. In cyclone events, the Queensland Fire and Emergency Service note that individuals need to be aware of their surroundings and take care when inspecting property and travelling, as there may be fallen trees and power lines, broken water and sewage lines, loose roof sheeting and other material. Again, this presents unique risks to individuals responding to environmental disasters, as well as to the persons that they are rescuing. Identification of these risks is the very reason why protection exists for authorised persons and authorised volunteers under Queensland's Disaster Management and Emergency Response Scheme. And this is why we believe that this protection should also be extended to community volunteers who step in and provide their actions in good faith and without reckless disregard. Furthermore, by not providing legal protection to community first responders or Good Samaritans, we are potentially adding further deterrent to those Good Samaritans to step in and help their fellow community members. The next point is that community volunteers are protected in all other Australian jurisdictions. All other Australian jurisdictions have enacted provisions providing protection against civil liability for Good Samaritans who act in emergency situations in good faith and without recklessness. The legislative provisions are reasonably consistent across the various jurisdictions. Furthermore, there was a civil liability Good Samaritan bill that was introduced in Queensland in 2007. Had this been passed, the bill would have brought Queensland in line with all other jurisdictions. The bill ultimately did not get enacted, likely because of a change of government at the time. The final point for why there should be protection for community first responders is that there is a bit of confusion that they are currently protected. A quick online search reveals that there is a misconception among Queensland organisations that community volunteers are protected from liability, with various websites falsely indicating that Queensland has a Good Samaritan Act. And we have screenshots from 2 of those websites up on the screen, essentially telling the reader that community first responders are protected from liability, which isn't the case. We've got 2 provisions on the slide clearly stating that liability at law will not attach to only medical practitioners, nurses, or other persons prescribed under regulation. So this misconception is concerning. It's misleading, and it's just another reason why we believe that community first responders should be protected.
So the good news is, and it's Leanne Collingburn again, the good news is that there are opportunities for reform in Queensland. As we mentioned, the disaster, Queensland's currently undergoing one of its most significant reforms in relation to Queensland disaster and emergency management systems. We've detailed on the slides there an update on that process. But essentially, as part of that process, we can expect public consultation on those reforms and hopefully new legislation and policy. And we think that it's a really good opportunity at that time to discuss and make provision for the role of community volunteers as we've defined them in Queensland's broader disaster and emergency management system, to provide much needed surge capacity and the fact that they're already doing so, and to better protect community volunteers from liability and risk in the circumstances that we've set out. So we'll now hand over to Jackie, who is going to talk about things from a community, a CLC perspective.
Thank you. I guess I'd start by mentioning that community volunteers aren't something that we've used as part of our flood response, but they are definitely part of the overall community response. Like everybody's mentioned, I know the fire disaster that's currently unfolding across Queensland and New South Wales. Those communities are still grappling with the immediate needs, and the media is already reporting that community volunteers have stepped forward to help in Tara by collecting clothes and in some cases protecting their neighbours' properties. Disaster recovery is built on members of our community supporting each other. Today I'll give just a quick overview because I'm conscious of time, and I hope everyone's getting their questions ready for Leanne while I give my 2 cents. It's just a quick overview about Caxton's disaster response. Most of our work has been in the recovery phase, and we've had experience in the 2021 and 2022 floods. So I thought I'd just give a quick overview of the experience we've had, talk about some of the learnings, and then talk a little bit about some ways that you can start getting ready, although it feels like we're there already, for instances that pop up in the future. Just one way to prepare is to share our learnings and to share our experiences from other events. So I was with Caxton for both our 2021 and 2022 flood responses. In 2021, we helped over 200 clients to dispute their insurance claims through internal and external processes. The majority of these clients were really surprised they didn't hold flood cover, and they expected their policies to respond. There was a lot of anger in the community and a lot of clients actively reaching out for our help. We attended town halls and community meetings to share local knowledge. And as we had a lot of clients in a short time, we did draw on pro bono volunteers at that stage, some of whom gave up their Saturday mornings to take statements from our clients. In this event, it became very clear that people didn't understand their policies or even that policies had limits. Caxton, with the broader consumer sector, lobbied for government to introduce a standard definition of flood so that consumers could better understand what their insurance covered. This definition was introduced in June 2012. And it's just an example I wanted to mention of one of the roles community legal centres can play in a disaster, of identifying issues that arise and getting involved in advocating for change before the next event arises. We established our next flood recovery team in May 2022, so a little bit after the event. We again gave legal advice and assistance to clients whose homes were damaged by the flood and the rain. And again, we did work helping people through their internal and external dispute processes. This time we were able to offer clients the support of a full-time social worker. Many of our clients had been living with physical and environmental concerns, financial strain and emotional stress for months. Our social workers helped clients go through the practical processes connected with their claims, such as supporting them through site visits from assessors or contacting builders or other trades. The social workers also connected clients with services to improve their mental health, access practical and financial supports. So what was different between those events? In February 2022, as you all recall, was a very different weather event. It was the rain bomb that sat over Brisbane was quite different from 2011, which had a significant amount of rain, but then had a number of people who were affected by blue sky flooding. So people had been affected in both events, but some clients really hadn't experienced something like this before. We could see the impact of the introduction of that standard definition of flood and the changes in the insurance market. More clients either knew they had flood cover or they knew that they didn't have it because they couldn't afford it. And an extra piece of work in this event was helping clients appeal government grants, including the structural assistance grants for people who weren't insured, and also navigating those processes with the Resilient Homes Fund with their buyback, home raising and resilient rebuild. So people really were juggling multiple processes at the same time. But one of the big differences we noticed in this event was that we didn't have that same wave of clients actively seeking us out. So we really had to do work in going to find the clients where they were. And one of the ways we did connect with clients was by working with groups of community volunteers. I've got two quick examples of this. One was running a Facebook Live event, partnering with other community legal centres and our colleagues at Legal Aid, just on one of the community suburban community pages. Members of the group could ask questions and get legal information in real time. And it gave us the chance to let people know that disasters can cause legal issues and there were free services there to help. The other example I have was collaborating with a recovery group in North Brisbane. It was just a group of residents who came together after the floods to support their local suburbs recovery and contribute to their preparedness for future floods. They worked on their own initiative, but they were partnering with their local neighbourhood centre. In July, I attended a local community festival and stood on a stand with this recovery group. I think this was more effective than, say, standing there on our own, as people who had been directly impacted by the disaster dropped by for a chat with people they already trusted and therefore felt comfortable sharing their stories and being referred to Caxton. So what did we learn? In this event, we didn't rely on volunteers as much as the first time due to the different volume of clients and the way they approached us. We did appreciate the support of our pro bono colleagues because they helped us develop resources and really gave us education and answered our questions on areas of law that weren't quite our bread and butter. We found the legal issues were much broader. Clients had different issues with their insurer. For example, a lot of clients might have gotten their flood portion claimed, but then they wouldn't get their roof or other parts of the house claimed due to maintenance, rot, gradual deterioration. Mould was a real issue for people and which is often excluded under the policy. So clients still had a misunderstanding about the extent of what their policy would cover. The impact of the rental crisis, the supply shortage and the trade shortage was all very real and it got in the way of client recovery. We had a lot more advice on cash settling claims as insurers were reluctant to do that work themselves. And the temporary accommodation benefits were often too short to meet people's needs. I think the most important learning for me, which is not earth-shattering was the ongoing collaboration with other organisations, both within our pro bono communities and our other community legal centre and legal aid organisations. But there was just so much value in building relationships with the disaster recovery ecosystem, particularly with local neighbourhood centres, recovery centres, service navigators, financial counsellors, charities, other support services, and groups of people who just came together to support each other. All of these organisations helped our clients get wraparound support and stay connected and build stronger communities. And many of our clients would not have found us without referrals through these organisations. Building and maintaining these relationships is important work to prepare us for the next event. So just to wrap up, because I know we are running out of time, through some of the work that Hopwood Ganam did, they pointed out some issues that can arise where an organisation really goes well outside what they set themselves up to do. A couple of things to keep in mind would be thinking about whether your insurance and speaking to your insurer to make sure that the change of service means that your insurance is still adequate, being aware of food licensing requirements, looking after your staff and the psychological and physical first aid issues that can arise, and ensuring that if you are harnessing a volunteer workforce, everyone is registered and you have a process for managing spontaneous volunteers. I think in the CLC sector, we have pretty good risk management policies in place that allow for flexibility. We already have processes that allow us to work off-site and supervise people remotely. We're encouraged to be accessible, trauma-informed, and work with our volunteers to make sure that they are as well. And we're pretty practiced at responding to disasters through the floods and COVID, just adapting our practices to know what works. But CLC Queensland has put together some, CLCQ has put together some resources on its climate and disaster recovery page that are specific toolkits that allow our organisations to think about how we prepare for the future and to do some high-level organisational planning. On this page, CLCs can access free toolkits to help to assess our resilience on climate change, disasters and emergencies. I encourage you all to work through these documents as your organisation has time to. And then I might throw to questions if there's any, Monica.
Thanks, Jackie, and thank you, Leanne and Jacob. That was so informative and comprehensive, and a really, terrific overview. We don't have any questions filed at the moment, but while we're waiting maybe for some to come in, I might just ask you, based on this sort of incredible work that you've done, what might be the next step, and what kind of learnings have you gleaned from it?
Yeah, thank you, Monica. It's Leanne responding to the question. I think, look, as we say, Queensland, we focused on Queensland in particular because this is one of the main jurisdictions that our firm operates in. There's the potential to do, obviously, a more holistic review in other jurisdictions as well, but based on a very high-level comparative analysis, it looked like Queensland was sort of, as we often do, standing on our own, unfortunately. And so I think the timing is really good in terms of the opportunity for the government and other decision makers to really look at this issue in relation to what we call community volunteers and a bit of a legal gap. There is, as we said, and Monica, you've pointed out in previous webinars as well, a significant reform in relation to Queensland's emergency and disaster management systems. And so we think it's a really good opportunity to look at this issue in a little bit closer and potentially make some changes to ensure that not only are our community volunteers or spontaneous or good Samaritans or whatever you want to call them are protected from liability in the same way that they are in other jurisdictions, but they're also at a policy level embraced so that, you know, and recognised for the really valuable surge capacity that they can provide, albeit with, you know, organisations preparing now or in the lead up to emergency seasons, which are, you know, very frequent, as we said, but preparing of how to best utilise the inevitable community volunteer who steps forward.
Yeah, that's really well said. And just so much compelling information, I really did think the quote from the Red Canoe, the person who was rescued by Red Canoe Man was that you had on your screen, Jacob, was really yeah, just so impactful. That is going to bring us to a close this afternoon. There are no more questions in the chat, so I would like to thank the three of you again for a really fantastic presentation and to a very attentive audience. Before everybody leaves, just remember to complete the feedback survey so that we can take that feedback and share it with our presenters once the webinar is closed. And that really helps us to continue to improve the webinar program. I'll just give one quick shout out for any lawyers or staff from Queensland Community Legal Centres that are on the line and would like to continue a conversation around disaster and climate justice. Community Legal Centres Queensland is holding its last exchange on Thursday the 16th of November. So tick the box on the feedback form and I'll make sure that you get added to that list as well. So thank you. That brings us to an end and we really hope to see you at the next webinar. Bye for now.